And bad morning to you. This is episode 53 of Bad Morning News, brought to you by Brave Browser, the ad resistant, tracker resistant browser, and our patrons. Thank you. This is being broadcast on the 3rd of October, 2018. And we've got a few major topics to cover today. Nothing too techy, thankfully, for those of you who are probably a bit teched out from yesterday's one. But we've got a bit on Kavanaugh and the ACLU, and a fair amount regarding the corruption of academia in an ideological perspective. But why don't we start off with that minimum wage hike that you brought up, Cryptic?
Sure. This is from Reason.com, written by Eric Boehm. DC repeals a minimum wage hike that restaurant workers didn't want. The poorly designed law would have left a lot of employees with less money rather than more. When DC voters approved Initiative 77 in June, they thought they were giving the city's bartenders and restaurant workers a boost in the bank account. But many of those workers didn't want the law, which they didn't think would work as advertised. Today, the city council answered those employees' appeals and voted 8-5 to, to consign Initiative 77 to the trash pile of bad policy. Though it was served up as a progressive plan to hike wages, Initiative 77 would have actually cost many workers money. The proposal abolished the so-called tipped minimum wage of $3.50 per hour, replacing it with a $15 minimum wage for all food service workers in the city. But workers that I and other reporters talked to before the vote told me that they often make far more than $15 an hour thanks to tips. Even if they don't, DC law required restaurant workers to make at least $12.50 an hour, with employers mandated to top up employees' pay if they earn less than that much in tips. Given the choice, many workers said they'd rather not earn $15 per hour at the cost of losing their tips. More than 8,000 of them sent comments to the city council urging them to repeal the measure. Mayor Muriel E. Bowser, a Democrat, has indicated she would sign the repeal. Supporters of Initiative 77, such as the union backed Restaurant Opportunity Center, have called the move to cancel the referendum's result flat out voter suppression. Hardly. With its vote on Tuesday, the DC City Council did what elected officials in a representative democracy are supposed to do: act as a check. After Initiative 77 passed, one of the biggest questions was whether the Democrat controlled City Council or the Republican controlled Congress, which has authority over policy making in the nation's capital, would be the first to strike it down. That should say something about the merits of the proposal, as should the fact that both management and employees were on the same side of the issue. Julia Calomaris, a server at Bistro du Quan on Connecticut Avenue, told me in June how frustrating it was that so many people thought the initiative would be good for restaurant workers. The ballot initiative amounted to giving help to people who aren't asking for it, said Calamaris, who has worked in the industry for 17 years. And there were also concerns about the unintended consequences of the new tipped minimum wage, which would have raised costs for restaurants and possibly forced cuts to staff. Ryan Aston, who tends bar at the Hamilton and who helped organize workers' opposition to Initiative 77, has said he was worried about the loss of prep cooks, barbacks, and bussers. If the law is a bad law, it should be amended or repealed. It does not matter if the law was adopted by the council, the voters, or Congress. Council Chairman Phil Mendelson, who sponsored the proposal, tells the Washington Post, and he's right. Yeah, so not surprising to see people who I'm sure believe they're doing what they are taught is a good thing for the workers, meaning raising the government imposed minimum wage, that it's actually counterproductive, and that the actual people who work in those jobs in that industry know that it's a bad law. And as mentioned in the article, there are always consequences to these arbitrary minimum law or minimum wage laws, as seen in places like Seattle, where I can tell you personally that the prices of everything has gone way up ever since they imposed the $15 minimum wage. And
No, no, say it ain't so. Say that putting a price floor on labor doesn't increase costs. No, it can't be true.
yeah, I mean,
Sorry, I had to. I just had to.
yeah, it's yeah, just one of those things where, when you have no understanding of economics at all, that's what happens is popular demands for these laws, and luckily in this case, Congress actually doing something beneficial and not just quelling this popular measure that's actually counterproductive.
Yeah, I mean, minimum wage is basically one of those really contentious issues that people will love to misrepresent you on. If you're not for the minimum wage, you're for poor people staying poor. No. If you're not for minimum wage, you don't believe that uh, the economic disparity is an issue. No, that's not true either. It's if you don't believe it works, that's why you're against it, not because you're for something else that's counter to everything that you believe in. It's because you know it doesn't work. It never really has. It always increases costs. It always creates job losses. It devalues other people's labor. The unintended consequences of minimum wage laws are some of the most diverse and painful ones that any society winds up having to experience. And yet people still think it's a necessity. And the head desk meme, that.
Yeah. Yeah,
It's
and
just not worth it.
yeah, exactly. And yeah, I've met many people who work in jobs where they were raised up to 15 an hour and they're still not making enough to live and to really afford to rent in most places in Seattle, just because that's the market. Our market is very in demand, and that raises costs and raises rents and raises property values, and just arbitrarily saying you have to make $15 an hour minimum doesn't magically make these people able to afford rents. I mean anyone making $15 an hour is still going to be living like four to an apartment probably, because it's still not enough, and now they're getting less hours because restaurants, as opposed to the opinion of most leftists, aren't just like rich people having sex in giant piles of money. The margin of profit, in especially in these mom and pop type restaurants, is
Mhm.
very low. I mean, they don't have money to be throwing out to people and say, hey, so
No, definitely
people are,
not. Off the top of my head, I can come up with at least 4 or 5 reasons why it's a bad idea. Because, say, for example, you're a company providing above the minimum wage. Well, with the minimum wage, if it goes up to the level you're offering, now the one thing that was drawing people to your company as good employees, aka, i.e., a bigger wage, is now gone because everybody else has to provide the same. So there's your incentives cut down. And same thing's true for the value of labor. As I said, if you were doing a job that before then was £10 an hour and the minimum wage goes up to that level, then you wind up having your labor being valued as the bare minimum that anyone could do in society from a value perspective. And people don't really consider things like that when they talk about minimum wage. They only look at the top line figures. They don't look at the minutiae and the detail. And they don't look at the job losses, which I'm assuming are also impacting Seattle. Although you'd probably have a better view of that, Cryptic, being there.
yeah, I mean, I've heard mostly that hours are being cut everywhere at bars, restaurants, and that type of thing, where people are just getting maybe getting part-time where they like full-time and getting even less and less in part-time. And so now where are they left? I mean, they're making 15 an hour, but they're having way less hours than they could have had
Mm.
before. So,
And
yeah,
therefore, they could have had more money because they would have had more hours to actually play with. So,
exactly.
yeah, it's a complex issue, and it's one that most uh, just like to say, oh, you just don't agree with people having what they need to survive. And no, it really has nothing to do with that. It has to do with viability, and that's the end of it. Um, Speaking of money issues, though, I thought it'd also be worth bringing up this article from the Washington Times, published on the 1st of October. Pentagon officials accused of artificially inflating costs to scuttle Trump priorities. Public opinion turned against military parades, Space Force, after high cost estimates. An eye-poppingly high price tag sank President Trump's plan for a military parade through the streets of Washington. Now, some analysts say opponents are using the same creative budgeting to scuttle or at least delay the creation of a U.S. Space Force. Pentagon officials are said to be artificially inflating the costs in hope of turning public opinion against the idea. The Air Force estimate that it will cost at least 13 billion over 5 years to stand up the Space Force has been met with skepticism amongst retired Defense Department officials and space policy specialists who believe Mr. Trump's proposed new military branch could be established for much less. Ironically, the debate over dollars comes at a time when, after years of pleading from the Defense Department officials and many lawmakers on Capitol Hill for more military spending, Mr. Trump last week signed a record level $716 billion budget for the Pentagon. Despite that unprecedented funding level, the idea of funneling 13 billion to a service that skeptics believe is wholly unnecessary, and which hasn't been given a clear, concise, and easily understandable mission statement, could ground that Space Force on the launch pad. That, analysts say, is exactly the point of cost estimates. This is the broadest possible definition of how you could scope a Space Force that anyone could possibly conceive, Todd Harrison, Director of Defense Budget Analysis at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, recently told Defense One. This cost estimate, it's just going to really look like they're trying to come out with a highball estimate to shift the debate into how expensive this is going to be. And sorry, there's apparently a bit more to this article. The money argument is particularly potent with a president who has prided himself on taking a skeptical eye to some security spending, including the cost of the F-35 fighter jet, the expenses moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and the expense of holding annual military exercises with South Korea. Former Pentagon officials say the sky-high cost estimate is further proof that the institutional resistance to a space force inside the Defense Department, unable to simply refuse Mr. Trump's direct order for a sixth branch of the armed forces, military officials could try to make the idea less appealing by highlighting the cost and complexity of getting it off the ground. There's a bit more to this article regarding the sticker shock that's going on, but I thought it was just a bit of an interesting twist, especially coming from the Times, not the Washington Post, that this particular entity is getting significant pushback. And to be fair, the cost is a concern, but that's also based on the idea that no such spending has ever been spent on any kind of military product that would have been sent into space, or that any vehicles exist today that fit the bill. Uh, and they're desperate to make sure that at least that stays the case. Whether or not it actually is the case is a different story. There's loads of patents out there apparently for ships that don't actually exist but could, and all sorts of unusual activity being broadcast on YouTube. So I'm not going to say what is or isn't in this situation because I don't know. But it's still an interesting concept when so many people say it does exist already, that they're pushing back saying it's too expensive to build. What do you think, Cryptic?
Yeah, it's interesting to see. I guess people who are more likely to support Trump and some of these things he wants to do, and for even them to come out and say, maybe we should take a step back and consider how expensive this shit is all going to be, and ask yourself if that's really in line with attempting to drain the swamp and shrink government insofar as they claim to support that. So especially with the military parade thing. I don't know what they were expecting with that, that it would just end up being free. I mean, anything the government, tries to spearhead or do in any sense ever cheap?
Mm,
Yeah.
never is, mate. But why don't we move on to Kavanaugh, I think. Let's start with the article from Robbie Sove from Reason. Why don't you read that one, and I'll read the follow-up one that you posted as well, because I've got some further information with regards to their advertising tactics.
Sure. Yeah, this is from Reason.com by Ravi Suave. The ACLU usually stays neutral on judicial nominees, but it just came out against Brett Kavanaugh. We oppose him in light of the credible allegations of sexual assault against him. The American Civil Liberties Union has decided to oppose the nomination of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, citing the allegations of sexual misconduct against the embattled judge. This is an unusual step for the ACLU, which almost never takes a position on judicial nominations. In its 98-year history, the Civil Liberties Organization's national board has only come out against a specific Supreme Court candidate in 4 cases. As a nonpartisan organization, the ACLU does not oppose Judge Kavanaugh based on predictions about how he would vote as a justice, explains ACLU President Susan Herman in a statement. We oppose him in light of the credible allegations of sexual assault against him. The Senate Judiciary Committee voted on Friday to advance Kavanaugh's nomination with the understanding that the FBI would conduct a limited investigation of the claims made by Christine Blasey Ford, a psychology professor who has accused Kavanaugh of attempting to rape her at a high school party 35 years ago. Kavanaugh has emphatically denied the accusation. As of yet, there is no evidence that corroborates Ford's story, and other alleged attendees of the party have failed to back up her account. But Kavanaugh's evasive and misleading statements about his teenage drinking have made it easier to believe that he is hiding something. Thus, I can understand why the ACLU would make an exception in this case. There's good reason to be concerned about Kavanaugh's character. Though absent additional information, it is impossible to say with any certainty what actually happened at that party 35 years ago. Kavanaugh is also accused of other instances of sexual misconduct in his high school and college years, but these allegations are more flawed than Ford's. But it would be easier to accept the ACLU's anti-Kavanaugh stance as a one-off move if the organization had not done so much recently that makes it appear like it's mutating into a generic progressive organization. The ACLU's Twitter feed recently seemed to endorse a catcalling ban, and the group's Michigan chapter sent a letter to Walmart imploring the company to stop selling Redskins merchandise. The letter heavily implied that continuing to stock Redskins gear was contributing to a hostile and educational environment in a local school, thus possibly violating the law. Former board member Wendy Kaminer has expressed serious concerns that the ACLU is backpedaling on some of its foundational free speech commitments in cases where the speech in question is offensive to the progressive left. Former ACLU president Nadine Strossen had a different perspective. The ACLU has done so much to protect civil liberties of all kinds of people. It would be a shame if it became just another left of center group primarily interested in rights violations that affect those in good standing with intersectional progressivism. So, yeah, that's the initial article that came out about the ACLU now coming out against Kavanaugh, and there's follow up to that.
Yeah.
which, yeah.
Yeah, that one's this is particularly bad. So not only did the ACLU come out in opposition of Ford, they actually decided to go full fake news on the situation, and sponsored an ad comparing Brett Kavanaugh to Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein. Again, from Reason, the ACL sponsors ad comparing Brett Kavanaugh to Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein. Such nakedly political propaganda is beneath the Civil Liberties Organization. The ACLU is not merely opposing Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation to the Supreme Court. The group has also spent $1 million to run attack ads in several states comparing Kavanaugh to convicted sexual predator Bill Cosby. We've seen this before, denials from powerful men, says the ad's narrator. We see the images of hashtag MeToo villains, former President Bill Clinton, former talk show host Matt Lauer and Charlie Rose, former studio executive Harvey Weinstein, Cosby, and finally Kavanaugh. The implication is clear. Kavanaugh is just like them. The ad is running in Nebraska, Colorado, West Virginia, and Alaska and is aimed at persuading fence-sitting senators to vote no on Kavanaugh. This is the tweet that came out from the ACLU. New. When we said we were going to use the full force of the ACLU to stop Brett Kavanaugh, we meant it. We're spending more than $1 million to run ads like this in Nebraska, Colorado, West Virginia, and Alaska, and they've got the ad right there. The ACLU's decision to formally oppose Kavanaugh was an unusual move for the organization, which almost never takes a position on judicial nominees. The decision to actively fight Kavanaugh by linking the uncorroborated allegations against him to the much more definitive, actually proven misbehavior committed by Cosby and others is something else, nakedly partisan. It's one thing to say Kavanaugh is not the best choice for Supreme Court. It's quite another to prematurely lump him in with Clinton, Cosby, and Weinstein. I would have thought such tactics were beneath the ACLU. This is a shameful moment for a once great organization. And I'm going to quickly read something that came to me directly from the ACLU, because I was a supporter of it for quite a long time. And this really got my goat. Imagine in America, in which a man who has sexually assaulted a woman sits on the highest court, wielding the power to judge the whole nation. Fewer than 24 hours after Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony accusing Judge Kavanaugh of sexual assault, the Senate Judiciary Committee decided to plow through the confirmation process and vote to confirm him as our next Supreme Court justice. At the 11th hour, senators finally agreed to move forward with an FBI investigation before the full Senate vote. But Thursday's hearing, along with the inadequate investigation of the allegations of sexual misconduct, have made this much clear. Kavanaugh cannot sit on the highest court of the land. We have high standards for lifetime appointments to the Supreme Court. That standard is not met when there are credible allegations of sexual assault against a nominee. The burden of proof is on the nominee, and Judge Kavanaugh has thus far failed to prove himself fit to serve. So pay attention to that, because remember, this is being written by the executive director of the ACLU as a plea via their, okay? So they're claiming it's a credible accusation despite no confirmations whatsoever backing it up that I am aware of, and have said that the burden of proof is on the accused. This is the ACLU saying this, one of the most recognized liberal institutions fighting for civil liberties, claiming there is no such thing as due process and innocent until proven guilty in the case of rape. And the claim of rape is a big stretch for me, if I'm honest. So how they're defining credible and all of these other allegations seems off, to say the least, especially as, and I shared this in the chat yesterday, 2 people have come out to the Senate Judiciary Committee saying they think they're the ones who actually did what Blasey Ford is claiming happened. So I'm not saying it never happened to her. I'm saying it wasn't Brett Kavanaugh who did it, because other people have taken credit for the event now. So I think this should draw a line under things, to say the least. But the fact the ACLU is doing this is atrocious. Absolutely atrocious. It wasn't just the executive director who contacted people on that chain as well. It was also their national political director. So, and they really were trying to do absolutely everything. They even make that comment quite clear from the political director. We're fighting to defeat Judge Brett Kavanaugh's Supreme Court nomination with everything we've got, in bold. So it's ridiculous, but this is what we're dealing with. So if you're ever have or would have considered donating to the ACLU, I would recommend reconsidering it at the moment, given the fact that they have drawn their battle lines quite clearly against due process and actual legal standards, from my perspective.
Yeah, I also used to receive emails from the ACLU. I was signed up to receive updates, and I'm not sure, I can't remember now exactly when I decided to unsubscribe and everything, but I know in the past maybe 5 years or so there have been a couple stories here and there where the ACLU has been seeming to have this left bias, and I guess at some point that kind of drifted away from them. I know one of the issues that kind of happened was with gun control. Especially recently, they've kind of come out and tried to, you know, uh, tout the popular line of, well, we need some kind of sensible, gun control, and that's not necessarily conflicted with the Second Amendment and that type of stuff. So there, at that time, I kind of definitely was like, oh, this is the direction they're going in now. And so this is definitely kind of the final nail in the coffin for me with them to see this. And but I'm not totally surprised, but it kind of seems like they're trying to reach out to the so-called progressives at this point. So I mean, that's pretty unfortunate from my perspective.
No, and I agree. But I think we should probably park the ACLU for a minute and let's have a look at universities. Um, there's a couple of things in cryptic. I'll be honest. I'd like you to read the article from the Quint that I'm going to make a mention to now, because this is going to lead up to a larger piece that one of our more recent subscribers has found for us. So let's delve into understanding universities as political battlefields for a moment.
Okay, yeah, this is from thequint.com, written by Mohammed Fajar, and there's this pop-ups everywhere. Sorry about that. Hold on a second. Understanding universities as political battlefields. And that author is, it says Northwestern University. I don't know if he's a professor there or what that is. Anyway, in Indonesia's latest crackdown against terrorism, the government has targeted universities whose staff and students hold radical views. A recent report by Indonesia's state intelligence agency, BIN, stated that radical groups have infiltrated 39% of universities in Indonesia. In June, Police Anti-Terror Unit Detachment 88 raided Riau University in Pekanbaru, Riau. The police arrested 3 people and confiscated explosive materials. Earlier this month, 6 universities signed an agreement with the National Counterterrorism Agency to counter the spread of radicalism in Indonesian campuses. There are concerns that such crackdowns and agreements might threaten academic life and undermine students' freedom. Some people believe that campuses should be free from any political activities. I suggest otherwise. Universities are never neutral grounds that can be isolated from political processes. History has shown how universities in Indonesia and other countries have been have become battlegrounds for different groups competing for political influence. Student politics, past and present, studies on global student politics have shown that universities are institutions where different political views compete to win influence. This kind of competition also exists in Indonesian universities. In the lead up to the 1955 general election, student groups mirrored political competitions at the national level. A study documents how political parties such as Indonesian Nationalist Party and Indonesian Socialist Party established the Indonesian National Student Movement and the Socialist Student Movement to extend their influence on Indonesian campuses. Meanwhile, another political party, Majumi, forged links with the Islamic Students Association. Its opposition partnered with the concentration of Indonesian student movements. HMI and CGMI were locked in a battle to win influence after the failed coup attempt on September 30, 1965. In the end, HMI triumphed, while CGMI and its patron PKI were banished from Indonesian politics. Politics also intervened in universities in Malaysia. Under a new economic policy in 1969, Malaysia's Ministry of Education ruled every university to use Malay as the language of instruction within academic community. The policy drew two opposing reactions from student associations. On one side was the University of Malaya's Malay Language Society, a student organization exclusively for Malays. On another side was University of Malaya's Student Union, a student organization which accommodated non-Malay students' interests. The clash represented how the racial policy at the state level shaped the politics of Malaysian student movements. In Indonesia, a study links Tarbiyah religious movement in universities with the Prosperous Justice Party, an Islamic party that has been able to gain considerable votes in post-authoritarian Indonesia. Meanwhile, in Malaysia, progressive student movements such as Malaysian Youth and Students Democratic Movement and Malaysian Muslim Students Association briefly won the political competition. The government responded by replacing critical lecturers and screening student representative candidates. These cases in Indonesia and Malaysia show how campuses are not quarantined from politics. Politicians often target students to win their support. In addition to political students' movements, it is important to note that the production of new knowledge in universities is a result of political processes. The New Order regime under the dictatorship of Suharto tried to influence and shape social science research. The regime actively censored researchers that were critical of the government. These researchers were banned from investigating sensitive topics. These topics include the wealth of former President Suharto and human rights violations in Aceh, East Timor, now Timor-Leste, and Irian Jaya, now Papua. The New Order administration created a watch list for scientists to tame their criticism. The U.S. shared a similar experience with Indonesia. Between 1960 and 1966, the country's defense ministry increased its social budget to $160 million US from $10 million. The huge budget was allocated to support Project Camelot, a project to help win the Cold War. Scholars from reputable universities like Princeton, Columbia, and Stanford were recruited for the project. But university academics don't always comply with the powers that aim to dominate knowledge production. They are also able to utilize their own influence and space to resist state domination. Dynamics within universities are always political, and different interests compete for influence. This competition, in turn, has shaped intellectual activities through their attempts to bring professors and students into political debates. Freedom never comes without power struggle. By understanding that universities are political battlefields, those who despise radicalism should mobilize a coalition to fight radicalism. This would be the more strategic move to defend academic freedom. Yeah, so that's basically an interesting look at just different examples of the way politics and universities interact in the realm of free speech and many other subjects. And this, I like the examples given. Because I really know nothing about Indonesian politics, but there's a lot that's similar to elsewhere in the world, and always something to learn from the things going on there.
Precisely, and that's part of the reason why I wanted to feature that before this next article, which is really an essay. I'm not going to read all of it. This is a deep read. People should. I'm going to put the link in the description of the video for this one in particular, because people should read this. It's both humorous and absolutely atrocious at the same time. Because the stuff that these guys managed to do, it's incredible. But it's also really disturbing. And it ties into the fact that universities are battlegrounds. They are where ideas basically come to do battle with other ideas. These philosophies, these groups of people that exist meld together, and they work together, and they're forced to interact with each other and change their preconceptions and misconceptions about other people in the process. But when you're presented with really bad thought viruses, like some of the ones that have been coming out in certain fields of the humanities in particular, um, it becomes a real problem. And I think I'll dive straight into this now. This is from Arrow Magazine, published yesterday by Helen Pluckrose, James A. Lindsay, and Peter Boghossian. Academic Grievance Studies and the Corruption of Scholarship. This essay, although hopefully accessible to everyone, is the most thorough breakdown of the study, and written for those who are already somewhat familiar with the problems of ideologically motivated scholarship, radical skepticism, and cultural constructivism. Part 1. Something has gone wrong in the university, especially in certain fields within the humanities. Scholarship based less upon finding truth and more upon attending to social grievances has become firmly established, if not fully dominant, within these fields. And their scholars increasingly bully students, administrators, and other departments into adhering to their worldview. This worldview is not scientific, and it is not rigorous. For many, this problem has been growing increasingly obvious, but strong evidence has been lacking. For this reason, the three of us just spent a year working inside the scholarship we see as an intrinsic part of the problem. There's a video that accompanies this, and I do recommend people watch it. It's quite short. It's very amusing. We spent time writing academic papers and publishing them in respected peer-reviewed journals associated with the fields of scholarship loosely known as cultural studies or identity studies, for example, gender studies, or critical theory, because it's rooted in that postmodern brand of theory which arose in the late 60s. As a result of this work, we have come to call these fields grievance studies in shorthand because of their common goal of problematizing aspects of culture in minute detail in order to attempt diagnoses of power imbalances and oppression rooted in identity. We undertook this project to study, understand, and expose the reality of grievance studies, which is corrupting academic research. Because open, good faith conversations around the topic of identity, such as gender, race, and sexuality, and the scholarship that works within them, is nearly impossible. Our aim has been to reboot these conversations. We hope this will give people, especially those who believe in liberalism, progress, modernity, open inquiry, and social justice, a clear reason to look at the identitarian madness coming out of the academic and activist left and say, no, I will not go along with that. You do not speak for me. This document is a first look at our project, an initial attempt to grapple with what we are learning and what it means. Because of the length and detail, it is organized as follows, putting factual information up front and more detailed explanations afterwards. I'm going to skip some of the bullet points here. This is on the methodology. Their approach is best understood as a kind of reflexive ethnography. That is, we conducted a study of a particular academic culture by immersing ourselves within it, reflecting its output, and modifying our understanding until we became outsiders within it, for lack of a better term, I suppose. Our objective was to learn about this culture and establish that we had become fluent in its language and customs by publishing peer reviewed papers in its top journals, which usually only experts in the field are capable of doing. Whilst our papers are all outlandish or intentionally broken in significant ways, it is important to recognize that they blend in almost perfectly with others in disciplines under our consideration. To demonstrate this, we needed to get papers accepted, especially by significant and influential journals. Merely blending in couldn't generate the depth necessary for our study, however. We also needed to write papers that took risks to test certain hypotheses, such as the fact of their acceptance itself makes a statement about the problem we're studying. Consequently, although this study does not qualify as being particularly controlled, we did control one important variable, the big picture methodology we use to write every paper. A paper writing methodology always followed a specific pattern. It started with an idea that spoke to our epistemological or ethical concerns with the field, and then sought to bend the existing scholarship to support it. The goal was always to use what the existing literature offered to get some little bit of lunacy or depravity to be acceptable at the highest levels of intellectual respectability within the field. Therefore, each paper began with something absurd or deeply unethical, or both, that we wanted to forward or conclude. We then made the existing peer-reviewed literature do our bidding in the attempt to get this published into the academic canon. This is the primary point of the project. What we just described is not knowledge production. It is sophistry. That is, it is a forgery of knowledge that should not be mistaken for the real thing. The biggest difference between us and the scholarship is we are studying by emulation, is that we know what we made, that we made things up. I'm going to skip to some of the examples. Here's some of the questions they ask. What if we write a paper saying we should train men like we do dogs to prevent rape culture? Hence came the dog park paper. What if we write a paper claiming that when a guy privately masturbates while thinking about a woman without her consent, in fact, without her ever finding out about it, that he's committing sexual violence against her? That gave us the masturbation paper. What if we argue that the reason superintelligent AI is potentially dangerous is because it's being programmed to be masculinistic and imperialistic using Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Lacanian psychoanalysis? That's our feminist AI paper. What if we argued that, quote, a fat body is a legitimately built body as a foundation for introducing a category for fat bodybuilding into the sport of professional bodybuilding? You can read how that went in Fat Studies. And there are links to all of these papers. At other times, we were scouring existing grievance studies literature to see where it was going awry, and then tried to magnify those problems. Feminist glaciology? Okay, we'll copy it and write a feminist astronomy paper that argues feminist and queer astrology should be considered part of the science of astronomy, which we will brand as intrinsically sexist. Reviewers were very enthusiastic about that idea. Using a method like thematic analysis to spin favored interpretations of data, fine, we wrote a paper about trans people in the workplace that does just that. Men use male preserves to enact dying machos masculinity discourses in a way that society at large won't accept? No problem. We published a paper best summarized, a gender scholar goes to Hooters and tries to figure out why it exists. Put another way, we now have good reasons to believe that if we just appropriate the existing literature in the right ways, and there always seems to be a citation or vein of literature that makes it possible, we can say almost any politically fashionable thing we want. The underlying questions in every single case were the same. What do we need to write, and what do we need to cite? All of our citations are real, by the way, to get this academic madness published in high, quote, scholarship. These people wrote 20 papers. 7 papers were accepted, 4 of them were published online, and they didn't have time to get the others to see publication through on the other 3 because they had to call time on this whole experiment. 7 papers were still in play, 2 of which had been revised and submitted, 1 under review, and 4 left hanging. 3 were fatally flawed. 4 invitations to peer review other papers as a result of their own exemplary scholarship were provided, and for ethical reasons, they declined all of those invitations. And then there was 1 paper, the one about rape culture and dogpox, that gained special recognition for excellence from its journal, Gender, Place, and Culture, a highly ranked journal that leads the field of, and I'm not making this up, feminist geography. The journal honored it as one of 12 leading pieces in feminist geography as part of the journal's 25th anniversary celebration. So that field has existed for 25 years, people. That in itself is a bit worrying. The papers presented shoddy methodologies, including incredibly implausible statistics, making claims not warranted by the data, ideologically motivated qualitative analysis. There was use of questionable methodologies in their analysis itself. There was plenty of things that should have, in any other field, gotten them thrown out on their ass. And they didn't. The only reason they came out when they did, which is quite recently, in the past in August, was when they started publishing through the Wall Street Journal, was basically people started asking, who are these new guys publishing all this stuff, and why are they in all these peer-reviewed papers? Who are they actually? And then the journals came back to clarify, are you who you actually say you are? Part 3, why do we do this? Because we're racist, sexist, bigoted, misogynistic, homophobic, transphobic, transhysterical, anthropocentric, problematic, privileged, bullying, far right-wing, cis, hetero, straight white males, and one white female who is demonstrating her internalized misogyny and overwhelming need for male approval, who wanted to enable bigotry, preserve our privilege, and take the side of hate? No, none of those apply. Nevertheless, we'll be accused of it, and we'll have some insights into why. Any not involved in academia, particularly those who are skeptical of its worth generally, it may seem like we're addressing yet another obscure academic squabble of little relevance to the real world. You are mistaken. The problem we have been studying is of the utmost relevance to the real world and everyone in it. As liberals, we recognize that you may be resistant to acknowledge that our evidence points to an undeniable problem in academic research on important issues relevant to social justice. The work done in these fields claims to continue the vital work of the civil rights movement, liberal feminism, and gay pride. It seeks to address the oppression of women and the racial and sexual minorities. Surely, you might therefore believe these bodies of literature must be essentially good and sound, even if you recognize some overreach and silliness. After having spent a year immersed in becoming recognized experts within these fields, in addition to witnessing the divisive and destructive effects when activists and social media mobs put it to use, we can now state with confidence that it is neither essentially good nor sound. Further, these fields of study do not continue the important and noble liberal work of civil rights movements. They corrupt it, while trading upon their good names, to keep pushing the kind of social snake oil onto a public that keeps getting sicker. For us to know anything about injustice in society and be able to show it to those who are unaware or in denial of it, scholarship into it must be rigorous. Currently, it is not, and this enables it, and social justice issues with it to be dismissed. This is a serious problem of considerable concern, and we must address it. Now, as I said, this is a massive article, and to be quite frank, I found it astonishing the kinds of things that we're actually getting in. And it initially took a lot of effort. They tried all sorts of things to kick off, and then they actually were rigorous about how they managed to get into these organizations and become published. And some of the thesis of Dog Park is where I'm going to finish this off with. That dog parks are rape condoning spaces and a place of rampant canine rape culture and systemic oppression against the, quote, oppressed dog, through which human attitudes to both problems can be measured. This provides insight into training men out of sexual violence and bigotry to which they are prone. That is the thesis behind that article. And the purpose of that was to see if it could be accepted in a journal. That's the only reason, to see if they could figure this out. And it did. That's the amazing thing, is it did get accepted and published by Gender, Place, and Culture. The selected reviewers' comments: "This is a wonderful paper, incredibly innovative, rich in analysis, extremely well written and organized, given the incredibly diverse literature sets and theoretical questions brought into conversation. The author's development of the focus and contributions of the paper is particularly impressive. The fieldwork executed contributes immensely to the paper's contribution as an innovative and valuable piece of scholarship that will engage readers from a broad cross-section of disciplines and theoretical formations. I believe this intellectually and empirically inciting paper must be published, and congratulate the author on the research done in the writing." It's all fake. That's the thing. All of it was fake. So I just find it insane. But I've spoken for quite some time on this, so Cryptic, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, well, just the last thing you said struck me, that it's fake. I mean, the thing with these journals these days is that I guess there's no line between what's fake and what's real. I mean, they're basically being subsidized by government-backed student loans and now have all this money to sit around and pay people to just make shit up out of thin air, I guess. And that's what you end up with, when you just when these federal loans create an artificial demand for these bizarre things that no one in reality would directly fund. I mean, well, if someone wants to, go ahead, but mostly, yeah, I mean, if most people had a choice, they wouldn't want to be paying for people to sit around and make up bizarre theories about dog parks and rape culture and whatever.
Mm, precisely. And I mean, the whole point of that was to just, as I said, to highlight the level of corruption that was endemic to academia in these fields, because they're fields that are currently being used not to study, but to promote a political belief or a political view. They aren't really there to fully study the view, because they've already come up with the conclusions they wish to draw. That's not study, that's pseudoscience at best, and just outright lying at worst. And it this is why I get so frustrated when I try to debate some people on these issues, is they're not working from a foundational premise that is rigorous, that has a lot of qualitative and quantitative analysis behind it, that backs what it says and is counter to what these fields say. And they consider themselves in isolation and basically will say everybody else is wrong. And I find that incredibly frustrating. Um, but it's unfortunate, it is what it is at the moment. But at least now we're seeing academics who, again, these are people who are self-avowed on the left of the political spectrum, and they're saying the left needs to basically throw this away as far as possible, because it is just literal poison to society. The kinds of things that are coming out are not rigorous. They're basically the same sort of things that would used to justify kinds of superstitions in a way. They have the same level of rigor as those superstitions do, to me.
Yeah, it's always a question of, just the self-eating left. As you said, there are still some on the left who do see all of this as totally ridiculous. But the question is, how are they going to be able to, get rid of that strain of thought within their ideology? I don't really know how they plan on doing that.
Me neither. There was one more article I wanted to bring up, but it's just gone 404 on me. So I'm going to see if I can pull up a previous copy quickly. Um, This was regarding a ricin incident um, uh, with Ted Cruz. Because apparently there was some sort of white powder. Yeah, there we go. And for some reason, it's not available anymore on Fox, but it is available on NBC. Um, Suspected ricin sent to Pentagon. Suspicious letters to Trump. Ted Cruz's office. The Pentagon letters may contain ricin, while the Cruz letter contained an unknown white powder by Moshe Gaines, Pete Williams, and Daniela Silva, and Courtney Cube. Sorry, published yesterday at 5:16 p.m. GMT. A flurry of suspicious envelopes targeting high-profile figures, including President Trump, Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and Senator Ted Cruz, were received in the past 2 days. The Secret Service said in a Tuesday evening statement they intercepted a suspicious envelope addressed to the president. The mail was intercepted at a location outside the White House. The Secret Service provided no other details about the envelope. We can confirm that we are working jointly with our law enforcement partners to fully investigate this matter, it said in the statement. Quote, further, all threats directed towards the president or any Secret Service protectee are treated seriously and fully investigated. Earlier Tuesday, 2 people were hospitalized in Houston after a, quote, white powdery substance was found in a letter addressed to campaign headquarters of Texas Senator Ted Cruz in Houston. Law enforcement sources said the conditions of the victims was not clear. The Republican Senate spokeswoman Catherine Frazier said no Cruz staffers were taken to the hospital. Frazier added that the package was opened in the lobby, resulting in a temporary lockdown. The Houston Fire Department said in a tweet that the 9th floor of the Phoenix Tower was evacuated as a hazmat team worked to determine the nature of the substance. The Houston scare came to light hours after NBC News reported that 2 suspicious envelopes containing the deadly ricin toxin were mailed to a Department of Defense mailing processing center. The envelopes were addressed to Mattis and Chief Naval Operations Admiral John. The source said. The mail facility is on the Pentagon campus, but not within the main building itself, said the Pentagon spokesman Christopher Sherwood. Law enforcement officials said all 4 letters, including the 2 sent to the Pentagon, appear to have come from the same person. Colonel Rob Manning, a Pentagon spokesperson, said in a statement that on Monday, the Pentagon Force Protection Agency, quote, detected a suspicious substance during a mail screening at the Pentagon's remote screening facility. The envelopes were taken by the FBI this morning for further analysis. All USPS mail received at the facility is currently under quarantine, he added. Federal officials said the ricin indication was based on a field test, and those are often unreliable. At this point, the official said the concern about these envelopes is low. There's a little bit more to this article, but yeah, basically, for some reason right now, it appears that we've just had a minor terror attack in the US of some description to some of our political elites, or at least a minor chemical one. That may be a sign of something else going on within. We have no idea. It's definitely something worth watching. It's worth highlighting as well to find out exactly what's going on there, because it shouldn't be something that anybody has to handle, a deadly toxin like that. It's very easy to wind up dying from those types of things. So let's see if there's some sort of solution to those types of problems before they happen. Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what comes out about this. It's definitely bizarre, and we've seen stuff like this happen before, and it became just really bizarre cases, as with the anthrax following 9/11. All kinds of bizarre goings on. So, yeah.
I think we'll hit up a couple of the items in chat now. Plus, going from a full-time to a part-time job kills an employer's eligibility for any benefits. This was regarding our minimum wage discussion at the start of the show. Yeah, it is a definite side effect, especially the way that the system works today. You don't necessarily keep your benefits if you're part-time. You're not the same as a full-time employee, so you're not treated the same as a full-time employee. It's another one of those side issues. I don't see how we can have an adequate defense when we know that China and other countries are actively working on satellite warfare, etc. Yes, again, they are working on solutions. I'd say that we've already built other things, potentially, but we as in the general public, don't know about them yet. Not officially, at least. Uh, Again, CJ, thank you for actually sharing that essay. With regards to the feminist geology departments, 25 years, that's an entire generation. And what the hell does feminist geologist even mean? I shudder to think of how this era will be judged if when people come to their senses. As I said in chat, with laughter, I hope, at least, or an abiding amount of shame, if not. It's well deserved at this point that we let society get down this far. Down the rabbit hole is worrying in the extreme. And I know people were shouting about it before now, but I don't know. Maybe we just didn't listen, or we didn't believe, one or the other. Now we can see quite clearly how perverse the system has actually become, particularly academia.
Yeah, sweet meteor death sometimes. Seems like it should win the next election.
Yeah, I know. Smaller Cthulhu definitely seems to be the most appropriate president for the coming election cycle, I think. I think Cthulhu may already be here with us today. Anyway, enough about H.P. Lovecraft. We're out of time, people. So thank you again for watching. And as our founder would say, smash the state, fuck the system, and have a bad morning, everybody.
Bad morning. See you all tomorrow.